everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back to Faraday Academy. I'm here with a special guest today. If you don't know him, this is Sid from another YouTube channel called DevOps Directive. Do you want to introduce yourself and then I'll introduce the stream?
Sure, sounds great. Thanks for having me, Gwen. As she said, my name is Sid. I'm a software engineer and I focus primarily on DevOps and cloud infrastructure technologies with a little bit of development thrown in there as well. So I read some application code, but a lot of stuff and sort of how we get that code, test it, bundle it up, deploy it, and then make sure it's operating as we want it to.
Sounds fun.
Yeah.
So I get a lot of questions on various platforms about careers in development and which career path, and there's just so many different types of careers you can have in software development now, and they're just getting they're just more and more all the time, and they're even more and more specialized and narrowly focused. So I wanted to do this career series to talk about some of the different types of careers, the different pathways you can take in software development and also in software development adjacent roles. So that's basically what we're going to talk about today. So to get started, of course you can tell from the title already, we're going to talk about DevOps today. So to get started, do you want to kind of give us the 10,000 foot overview of what is DevOps and just introduce us to the world of DevOps.
Sure. So DevOps is a combination of two words, development and operations. And so I think most people, probably your audience, is very familiar with the first of those two, right? Developing software applications to do various things, oftentimes in the context of a web application that you're deploying and people are interacting with via a browser. The second half of that is operations, and that's all about taking those software applications and deploying them on a server somewhere and making sure that they are working as expected, that they can handle the amount of traffic that they're going to receive. And historically, those have been somewhat separate functions. Within big companies, you'll have one team building the application, and then they kind of get their features in place and everything's ready, and then they hand it off to the operations team, who take that and deploy it onto some server, usually a virtual machine. Could have been a while ago on a bare metal server in a data center somewhere that your company owned. But having those as two separate functions ends up being not the best practice, because you have developers making choices about how they write their application code that maybe influence how you should operate it, and vice versa, where the operators might not have all the context into how the application is written. And so DevOps is all about bringing those two functions closer together and how you can leverage the best practices on both sides to give insights and make your software development team work more efficiently, build applications better, and operate them more efficiently.
So you mentioned large companies that they had separate operations and developer roles. Was that the same for all companies? And also now that there's this new role, DevOps, which kind of merges the two, do you see most companies, even large companies, switching over to that model?
I think large companies have the luxury of having more specialization within any given role. And so there's enough work for someone to focus on front-end development, and for someone to focus on back-end development, and for someone to focus on the infrastructure stuff. At a smaller organization, whether that's a startup with just a handful of engineers or maybe somewhere in between, everyone has to, just by necessity, wear more hats and do more things. And so you end up having people that do span that entire application stack and infrastructure stack. And so it becomes a bit more blended, I think, within smaller organizations. But definitely more and more people are embracing this concept of DevOps. And you mentioned it as a role. Some people actually disagree with the fact that DevOps should be a role or a job title in and of itself, and think of it more as a culture or a set of practices and tools that everyone should be embracing, and not just having sort of a dedicated DevOps function, but instead it's a thing that can be rolled out across a team, and everyone can figure out how DevOps can make an impact for their particular role.
Awesome. So if anyone has any questions in the chat, I'll keep monitoring the chat so I can ask Sid. Otherwise, we're just going to go on. So, so you talked about the role of DevOps. So what are the skill sets you need as a DevOps engineer that are kind of different from being a software developer or even a cloud engineer? Maybe like, where does DevOps fit?
Yeah, I think DevOps, that's a good question, because it requires context from both sides of what I described earlier, where it's very helpful to understand the application code, even if you're not the one directly writing it. And it's also very useful to understand Linux fundamentals and running servers and how containers work and whatever your deployment setup is on the other side. And so the skills that you really need to be somewhat of a generalist, because you're touching things across that entire span from application code to the infrastructure layer. And so on any given day, I'll find myself sometimes debugging something at the application level, sometimes debugging something at the infrastructure level. And so being able to think about things from a systems perspective and quickly gain context on like being able to read code efficiently, so that if you find a bug, you can figure out what the root cause is as quickly as possible. So yeah, I think having a pretty broad skill set across both application development and infrastructure is super useful, and being willing to jump around between the different levels and layers to figure out how to best take the next step in debugging or building out some functionality.
So real quick, the company that you work at, how big is the company you work at?
So I have an LLC that is just me, and I have clients that I work with, usually startups that range from a handful of engineers up to one of my main clients right now has probably 12 engineers and 10 data scientists, and I support them primarily on helping to improve their DevOps posture.
That's awesome. Because actually I work on the other side, so I work as a developer with all those companies, and the big hiccup, we build this beautiful application and then it's like, man, we have to deploy it now. So that role that you play with those companies is really key, I guess, for companies that probably aren't quite big enough to hire a full-time DevOps person.
That's exactly right. So the niche that I fill as a consultant is those companies that have a number of software engineers, but those engineers are usually product-focused engineers who are iterating on the product, making sure that the user experience for that end user is really magical. They usually will have set something up. They have it deployed, but none of them, or oftentimes none of them, are experts in cloud infrastructure or setting up these automated processes. And so at a certain scale, those systems that they put in place start to break down, right? They maybe have some brittle pipeline that sort of works, but oftentimes fails, or there's just a lot of toil and manual process that they do with each deployment or what have you. And so they're in a place where they could use some help, but it's not quite enough for a full-time person to come in and do that stuff all the time. And so that's where they can hire someone like me to help them out 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week. We can define a set of objectives around things that they want to improve about their developer experience, about their deployment process, and then I can work with them to help implement those.
That's awesome. I have so many questions about that.
And then ideally, if I do my job well and that company continues to grow, they get to the scale where it is a full-time role and they can hire someone full-time and I can move on and help the next company out.
That's awesome. So we have a couple questions. First, Ford, I think you touched on this earlier, but Ford is asking, is DevOps a separate discipline?
Yeah, I think more and more these days people think of it as a separate discipline, but I tend to approach it as a thing that can be applicable to pretty much any software engineer. And the better your DevOps practices are, the better their lives are going to be. There's going to be less manual steps and things that are breaking randomly. And so ideally, if you're developing application code, you can write your code and check it into a branch on your version control system, whether that's GitHub or what have you, automatically get some deployment to sort of test your new features and be able to send a live link to someone to test those out. There's all sorts of things that will just make the lives of developers better that we, as DevOps focused people, can help to implement and help to roll out.
Awesome. So actually, Mahul from CodeDam, you probably know him. He
I do know Mahul.
had a really good question. How did you wind up in DevOps? What was your journey? Did you start in software development, or how did you wind up with this role?
Yeah, so my journey into software, actually I did not study software engineering or computer science in my schooling. I studied mechanical engineering, and then I spent 5.5 years working for a large aerospace contractor, working sort of at the intersection of mechanical engineering and software engineering, focused on control systems. So writing software to both control and model the dynamics of mechanical systems, whether those were satellites or lasers or what have you. And so I was enjoying the software portions of that job the most. Of all the different tasks that I was doing, like actually designing and writing software were the pieces that I was finding most enjoyable. And so after having spent a number of years in that role, I just slowly started volunteering for more and more software tasks instead of hardware tasks. And so I was able to morph the balance of work that I was doing more and more towards the software end of the spectrum. And then in 2018, I ended up leaving that role and deciding to go into software full-time. And here in San Francisco, where I live, there's just tons of both large tech companies, startups, building really interesting web applications that are targeting some really cool and challenging opportunities. And so I applied to a number of companies, ended up working for a health tech startup for about 18 months, where I was a full stack engineer. I found that I was not very good at making things look nice on the front end, and so slowly made my way back to the back end and started working more and more with the cloud infrastructure and the DevOps aspects of what that company was doing. And that was really where I both found the most enjoyment and was naturally well suited to. I think sort of the systems level thinking that I developed as a mechanical engineer and working on these large mechanical systems applied really well to the cloud infrastructure and systems architecture components of software development. And so it was a natural fit then for me, given that I was enjoying it and it seemed to be the thing that came most naturally to me, to really go all in on that portion of the technology stack. And so for the last 6 months of that role, and then the past 1.5 to 2 years since that role, I've really been hyper focused on DevOps and cloud technologies. And yes, occasionally I'll write some application code, but usually it's best if I'm focused on sort of the systems around the application and the tooling.
So, and this kind of ties into the next question. So how much coding would you say you do? And the question by Osel, is that how you pronounce it? He asked, as a DevOps engineer, how do you use scripting?
Yeah, so how much coding do I do? That is a good question. I think, are we counting YAML as code or not code?
I think that counts.
So YAML is a configuration language, kind of like JSON, if you're familiar with that, in which you can define all sorts of things. But in DevOps and cloud, you're often using this language called YAML to define your infrastructure configuration or your application configurations. And so there's a fair amount of that type of configuration work, which may or may not be considered programming, depending on who you ask. And then I'd say probably, I don't know, 30 to 40% of my time is that type of configuration style work, and then probably 30 to 40% is application development, but usually kind of at the layer where the application meets the infrastructure. So for one of my clients, I'm working with them on essentially deploying a bunch of simulation workloads onto Google Cloud. And we're using a platform called Kubeflow, which runs on top of Kubernetes. There's many, many layers of abstraction there. And a lot of the work that I do is in their Python SDK that they're developing for these simulations, but where we're using the client for this Kubeflow platform. And so building abstractions on top of what exists to make it easier for the data science team to define and utilize these underlying resources. So they have to think less and less about, oh, where is this code running in a container? How much memory and CPU does it need? How does that actually get scheduled? And more about, hey, what is the core simulation that I'm trying to run? And then we can abstract away as much of the surrounding details as possible. And so what I'm writing there is it is Python code that is the intersection between the simulation and the infrastructure that it's running on.
Do you miss writing more code?
I think I have a good balance right now that I enjoy. I think for my personal interests, having that split of like half and half between the two, and then if you were doing the math, I only made it up to 60 to 80% if you were adding my percentages, and so the rest is probably things like coordination with the rest of the team, or writing up documentation, or scoping out how we should do something, and that'll get me to the full 100%.
I wasn't counting.
I'm sure someone in the audience was going to call me out saying, "Oh, you only made it to 80% there." But then I also have to spend some time on YouTube videos and all sorts of stuff. So,
is that how you get clients?
It's a mix. I'd say most of my clients come through my network. So, both professional network from previous roles that I've had, but also personal network through the schools and degrees that I've obtained. And then some work comes through inbound emails or Twitter DMs that find me through YouTube videos or blog posts and that sort of thing. The split there is probably 80-20 between my network and the just raw, like cold inbound from content that I've made.
Awesome. So
I haven't done too much like business development though, so I think I could change those percentages if I actively started asking for people to reach out who are interested in support. But right now, the main client that I have gives me the level of work that I want relative to the content time that I need, and so I haven't pushed to try to find more clients in the last 6 months or so.
Yeah, it sounds like you have plenty of work. So Igor, this is a good question. So is it better then if you want to get into DevOps, is it better to be a sysadmin first or to be a software developer? What would you say?
Those are both valid paths. I think having one of those as a background, rather than just jumping in and saying, I want to go into DevOps, and having neither of those as a background, is a very good idea. But I don't think I've seen people coming from either end be very successful, and you just bring a different skill set that is valuable, but I wouldn't put one over the other. So I think having one of those experiences is very important to help you start on the right path in DevOps, but either are perfectly valid options. So I wouldn't say definitely go development first or operations first. I come from the development side, but that's just that's just the path that I happened to take.
Yeah, I would think being a software developer helps you out a lot because you know the application side, and I'm sure you've seen the struggles from the application side of people deploying.
Yeah, for sure.
Of developers deploying applications, because you almost, just from my experience, there's so many new things, of course in software and everything, but in DevOps, that it's really hard for a developer to be building the application and then keeping up with everything they need to know to properly set up continuous integration, continuous deployment, and and at the same time think about security and all those other things that you have to think about when you're deploying an application.
Definitely, and I think coming from a development background, the knowledge gaps that I had to fill, or the things that I had to focus on learning as I moved more into DevOps, were around what you were describing: the Linux fundamentals, the networking, the security aspects, things like Kubernetes or whatever platform you're deploying into. So that was where I had to focus my learning efforts. If you're coming from the other side and you have a system IT administrator type background, you probably already have a lot of those fundamentals down. And so instead, the things that you would be focused on would be building up that application development knowledge of how do we actually build and deploy, build what goes into building a web app? Like why do we have this separation of the front end from the APIs, and where does different logic occur or take place? And so just depending what your background is and what base you have, you'll need to focus on different topics to brush up and fill those knowledge gaps as you want to be successful in DevOps.
So Mohammed said, he wants to, so you were talking about your journey, how you got into DevOps.
Mm-hmm.
He asked, could you talk about why you went into consulting in DevOps?
Sure. Yeah. So I was working.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was working at this health tech startup here in San Francisco, and I had been there for about a year and a half, and I ended up just getting fairly burnt out in terms of the tasks the set of tasks that I had accumulated. Some of which was DevOps and I was enjoying, but there were some other aspects of things that I had happened to volunteer for that didn't align with what was bringing me joy at the time. And so I ended up in this place where I needed to take a step back. So I let them know that and transitioned all my projects. And then in that period of downtime between that role and when I was planning to apply to more roles, I started the YouTube channel and my technical blog at DevOpsDirective.com. And that was just a mechanism for me to continue to learn and build things and teach, which is something that I really enjoy. And while I was doing that, a few of the articles and videos, mostly the articles early on, the videos didn't get much traction, but a few articles took off and brought some inbound interest from a friend who had a company that needed some help. And so I wasn't even planning to start contracting at the time, but the skill fit and the need was really well aligned. And so it seemed like an easy way for me to dip my toe back in the water of working on a part-time basis. But as a contractor, I was really able to separate cleanly work from life and understand from a mental perspective which time was client time and which time was personal time. Whereas when I was working full-time at the startup, I really struggled with that. And I think that was one of the factors that led to some of that burnout.
Yeah.
And so that experience of that first project ended up being a really positive one. I really enjoyed it. And I realized that niche of these companies that don't necessarily need a full-time DevOps person, but do have a real need when it comes to implementing some of these things exists, and people are actively looking to fill that type of gap in their team's skill set. And so from there, I just continued to branch out and picked up some other smaller contracts along the way. And it also allows me to dynamically ebb and flow client work to offset the time that I want to be spending creating this educational content. And so in any given week, I might work 10 hours for clients and the rest on content, or I might flex it up to 30 or 40 hours a week with client work, depending on milestones and goals that we have with those particular clients. So yeah, it's been a really good fit for me. Eventually I may go back to working full-time somewhere, but I currently enjoy the split that I've got going on.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a need for that role. I work on so many projects where I'm like, man, I wish I had a DevOps person right now. So Osale again, he asked about which cloud. I feel like this is a pretty common question. There's a lot of parity and similarities between all the clouds? I guess because everyone kind of followed the AWS model. But is there one you would recommend, one that's easier to get started with, or better for deployments, or just your preference, I guess?
Sure. I think there's a few answers that I'll give depending on the situation that you're in. AWS is the largest and most popular. So from a career perspective, if you're hoping to get a job working in cloud technologies for a company, AWS is the, I think, clear leader there, in that there's going to be more demand and more options of people who are already using AWS. And if you can demonstrate that you know how to build things and deploy things onto AWS, your skill set will be immediately relevant to those companies. Yeah. I'll add that I think AWS is slightly less approachable, and the learning curve is steeper than some of the other clouds. Of the three hyperscale clouds, AWS, GCP, and Microsoft Azure, I have found that GCP is the easiest for me to understand, and that may be because that was where my first experience was, but I think others that I've talked to have felt something similar as well, and just in terms of it's slightly easier and more approachable. When you go to their interface, it's not quite so overwhelming. It's still overwhelming, but it's not quite so overwhelming.
That's funny because I had the opposite experience. I think
oh, really?
Because I've used AWS the last 5 or 6 years. I've almost entirely used AWS, and then switching to Google Cloud. Actually, just recently, I've been using Google Cloud for a client project. I'm like, man, I wish.
Maybe it's just familiarity then, and whatever you've built these memory patterns of where stuff is and how stuff works, and the names of all the systems and services and how they fit together. There's also a whole nother tier of clouds that aren't quite at the scale that those three that I just mentioned are, oftentimes referred to as alternative clouds. Those would include things like DigitalOcean or Linode or Vultr. And they have many of the things that many of the core features that like a GCP or AWS would have, but only those core features. So rather than 180 different services that do everything that you could possibly imagine in a managed form, they might have 10 or 20 things, and those things are going to be virtual machines, networking setup, storage, object storage. Many of them now also have a managed Kubernetes offering, because that seems to be table stakes for clouds that are trying to gain popularity amongst companies and developers. And so those, some people will find to be much more approachable in terms of just getting started, because you go to their interface and there's only 10 things to choose from instead of 200.
Yeah.
And so those are very good if you just want to build something and you're trying to learn, versus like use it as a career stepping stone that you can use to get as an in at a company. I think getting started with one of those people might find as a really smooth experience that's easier to get started with. But I think from a career perspective, one of the big three are probably more valuable skills to have on your resume.
Those alternative clouds, are you talking about I guess like Heroku style clouds that kind of make it easy for developers, like Vercel, that type of thing? Or?
So alternative clouds are still giving you those fundamental building blocks of you go and you provision a VM, a virtual machine, or you go and you can set up an S3 compatible object store where you can store your files. So those are still providing those same primitives. Mm-hmm. What you're describing with a Heroku is what I would call a platform as a service, PaaS, where they abstract away a lot of the details from you as a developer. So no longer do you need to know, oh, my code is getting containerized and then deployed onto this system. Instead, as long as you adhere to their sort of set of guidelines of how you structure your code and check it into the right place in GitHub and connect the repository to Heroku, they then go off and handle all of the DevOps behind the scenes. And so if you are an individual developer, a small team of developers, I think getting started on one of those platform as a services, and so Heroku's one, Google has App Engine, DigitalOcean just added one. AWS has a few different things. They have like Elastic Beanstalk and Lightsail and a few different things that would sort of fall under that PaaS, platform as a service category. And I think getting started with one of those can help relieve a lot of the headache of having to set up CI/CD and manage your own servers. You do pay a slight premium in terms of just the raw compute. If you had all that set up yourself, the platform as a service is going to cost more. The platform is charging you for what they are doing. They're adding value. And so I think a pattern that I see, and that is a great one, is to get started with one of those. And that allows you to really iterate quickly on your product and not worry about as much of the system level things or the DevOps-y type things. And then as your needs grow, either your bill starts to grow because you're gaining traction and lots of people are using your application and that price point becomes unbearable, or you start to need more flexibility. And like, in order to provide this magical experience, those platforms have to put certain rails in place that keep you, as long as you follow their guidelines, you can get all this automation out of the box. But if you then need some feature that is not supported, now you need to sort of break out of that walled garden and start to implement some of this yourself. And so I think that pattern of getting started with a platform as a service until it no longer suits your needs, either financially or technically, and then branching out and building your own platform is a really great way to go.
That makes sense. Yeah, I use Elastic Beanstalk a lot. I didn't know DigitalOcean came out with one. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, I think it's fairly recent. They may have acquired a couple of companies and now have bundled it into a PaaS offering.
Yeah, I really like them. Let's see. Oh, Albert is asking about, besides your mechanical engineering degree, what other qualifications? Do you have any certifications or anything?
I don't have any certifications in DevOps. I have considered getting some of the Kubernetes certifications. So there's 3 Kubernetes certification. There's one, the CCAD, which is focused on the application development side of Kubernetes. There's one, the CKA, which is focused on the administration side of Kubernetes. So if you were actually deploying and managing it yourself, that would be the one that you would want. If you're using one of these managed Kubernetes as a service, like Google Kubernetes Engine or Elastic Kubernetes Service on AWS, they manage a lot of that admin work for you. And so the CKA is less relevant there. And then they also recently added a security focused one, the CKS. There's Docker certifications and AWS and GCP certifications. I've considered them. I think they are useful if you are taking them from the standpoint of wanting to learn the topics, but I don't recommend going off and just chasing certifications for the sake of getting certifications. Experience generally outweighs certifications if people are looking at you as a candidate to fill some role. And so, yes, if all things are equal, then having the certification versus not is usually a positive. But it has not been a roadblock to me. And I'm very fortunate having an advanced degree from a school like MIT that like carries a lot of weight when they see that on my resume. And so I think that has helped me to not need certifications as much. So yeah, a long-winded answer to say, I don't currently have any. I've considered them. I think they can be valuable, but they are not the end-all be-all of getting work.
It's interesting because in software development, programmers, it's not really, like there's no certification that I know of that really holds a lot of weight.
For the development side, yeah.
Yeah, but when you get into those, the adjacent roles like DevOps or security, like there are just so many certifications all of a sudden, and they're actually by authorities in the space. So it's kind of interesting that programmers, we don't really get certified. It's kind of a free-for-all. We just build a portfolio and show off our skills, and that's it. Yeah,
that is interesting. I wonder what drives that proliferation of certifications in the cloud space. I'm not sure. I think maybe it's that. Yeah, I don't know.
All right, so I'm looking for a question. Sometimes it's hard to scroll up and down the chat. Oh, here it is. So Ford asked the question about YAML. He's just kind of saying, what do you think about YAML and what issues would its replacement or the next thing solve, or features? So I guess
I can talk about that a little bit. So YAML in and of itself is a configuration language. You don't have things like you would have in a general purpose programming language, like for loops and while loops and conditionals. You literally just write out data, and that data is static. And so when you use YAML to define something about your application, let's say you have a configuration for how your application should be deployed, and now you want to have some flexibility in how you use that. So maybe you have a development environment and a staging environment and a production environment, and those each you want to have configured slightly differently. Maybe in development you have 1 copy of your application, and in production you have 5 copies of your application, or maybe you have it tagged a certain way. Your container image or your deployable unit is tagged in a certain way, and you need to be able to update that YAML file accordingly. You end up using templating tools, and there's a number of tools that exist. One that is common is called Helm. Another that people often use is called Customize. It's not really a templating tool, but it allows you to have overlays that modify your YAML based on different environments. And so you end up using all these tooling to manipulate your YAML files in a certain way. And that can be good and bad. I think YAML is a very compact way to express these configurations, but you then need all this tooling around them to make them dynamic. And so if you are able to define those same types of things in a general purpose programming language, you could have that dynamic element without this additional tooling. It also would allow you to work with those configurations using all the niceness that your IDE, your integrated development environment, brings in terms of syntax highlighting and linting, and you could use your normal testing tools, etc. And so I have seen a few projects start to explore this space of moving away from YAML and using general purpose programming languages to do similar things. Pulumi is an infrastructure as code tool that allows you to do some of that, which is kind of interesting. Chris Nova, who is an expert in Kubernetes and built a lot of things, has released a project called NAML, which stands for No More YAML. And so that project is focused on essentially defining Kubernetes resources in Golang, and has a number of features around allowing you to do that in an efficient manner and test those configurations and deploy those configurations. And so, I think there's some interesting things happening in that sort of what does the future of configuration look like, and whether it will continue to be YAML or whether there will be something else that will take its place. I think some of those ideas will get implemented and become standard. Some of them may or may not, but it's definitely an interesting thing to follow.
Yeah, there's so many different rabbit holes we can dive into here. Let me see. There's one question. I can't find it now, but basically, I think it was something like an example. So I guess in your day-to-day work, what's an example of your workflow, something you would set up for a client If I find the question, I'll put it up on the screen.
Yeah, that's a well-formed question. I do all sorts of things for clients, ranging from I've gone in and helped them to automate some process that they were previously doing manually. So usually that involves building out a pipeline using one of the CI tools that exist, whether that's GitHub Actions or Circle CI or Cloud Build or what have you. And so it's using that tool and likely some shell scripting to accomplish a task that previously they were doing manually and automate that so that it can be done with every new pull request or maybe on a recurring schedule with a cron string, so it runs every night, etc. And so there's that type of work. There's the type of work kind of migrating from one platform to another. Mm-hmm. And so maybe someone has followed that path that I was describing of building on a platform as a service, and now they want to migrate off it. And I have helped to do that. So like, here is the path that we need to take and the things that we need to change to add our own tooling where the Heroku or whatever was managing it all for us before. Yeah, so it varies, but a lot of it is around sort of helping clients to better use their cloud infrastructure or migrate from one system to another or automate things within their company that previously were manual. So it's usually about asking the right questions and finding bottlenecks that exist and then helping to alleviate those bottlenecks. So if there are things that the software engineers are wasting a lot of time on, if you can identify what those are and how to address them, that now can relieve a lot of that pressure and give more time to focus on improving the application itself, versus most software engineers who don't focus on DevOps don't want to spend time dealing with configurations and trying to get the settings just right. And they would prefer to build their application and have it just work, right?
Yeah, that's what developers prefer. Okay, so we have time for like 2 more questions. So real quick, Julio is asking about Terraform. So Terraform is a tool for DevOps. Well, I'll let you talk about what it is. And he's asking how it impacts the whole DevOps process.
Yeah, so Terraform is a tool in the category of tools known as Infrastructure as Code, IAC. And so it is how you can define your entire cloud infrastructure via config files that live in your code base. And so rather than going to cloud.aws.com and clicking the buttons and saying provision one virtual machine and configure its networking like so, you use a tool like Terraform, and they have their own domain-specific language called HashiCorp configuration language, where you write out these template files that say, we want one server in this region with this much CPU and this much memory, and here's the firewall rules and blah, 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 blah. And so you write all that out as a configuration file, and you then use Terraform to deploy it rather than going and clicking the buttons in the UI. And there's a few benefits to doing it that way, right? You now have a repeatable process, so you can deploy multiple versions or slight variants of that code to, let's say, a development staging and production. You also now have a way for your team to reason about the infrastructure and have a shared understanding of what is actually deployed. So now we can go to GitHub and see that configuration, and it should match exactly what exists in your cloud provider of choice, versus if you went in and clicked a bunch of buttons, maybe you as the person who did that have a good idea of how it's configured, but you're probably going to forget. And 2, anyone who isn't you, who did not click those buttons, it's very, very hard for them to have a reasonable chance at knowing what the actual deployed configuration is. And so tools like Terraform or Pulumi or CloudFormation, there's a whole set of infrastructure as code tools. They enable that type of shared reasoning and testability and repeatability to your infrastructure stack in a way that previously wouldn't have been possible. So I think it's a huge benefit to have tools like that in the tool chain.
So, real quick, what are your thoughts on learning on, I guess, languages? So I know Python is probably the biggest in DevOps, and you mentioned Golang as well. Is it worth it to learn a few different languages, or is it enough to just know Python and some configuration?
Knowing at least one general purpose language, I would say, is very valuable. You're going to need that to have the context into the application development side. So knowing at least one language, and ideally the language that the team is using to build their applications, so that if you have to dive into that code to debug anything. Golang is an interesting one and is quite valuable for DevOps. It has kind of become the language of choice for building DevOps tooling. So a lot of the tools that you'll be using around Kubernetes or other tools are written in Golang. And so being able to dive into that code, if you reach some edge case that the tool is not working for, knowing some Golang can be very valuable. I am not a Golang expert. I read some Golang, but I haven't really written much. So that is a skill set that I would hope to continue to build on. But yeah, definitely a useful one.
Yeah. Okay, last question, and I think someone, here it is. So, if someone wants to get into DevOps, from whatever path they're taking, what are the best resources, pathways, anything you recommend for them?
Yeah, so definitely go to my channel and subscribe and smash the like buttons and the bells and all the YouTube things, right? But a more serious answer is there's a roadmap. What is the URL? I'll find it and we can put it. I think it's roadmap.sh. Roadmap.sh/DevOps. So maybe you can put that in the chat or something. But it's a website that has what looks like a very intimidating roadmap, but I think the key is that you can use it just to identify what there's a lot there. Yeah, so don't look at this and get overwhelmed. Instead, look at this as here are all the potential things that I could learn, and I want to pick things that jump out to me as interesting or things that are gaps in my knowledge. And the other thing about this chart is that it has many options for lots of the different steps along the roadmap. And so you generally only need to pick one of those. So the very first step there, learn a programming language. They then offer 7 choices. They give the preferred choice of Go, but all these other choices are also good if you wanted to pick one or already have one of those skills. And so for each step along here, you can think about, okay, 1, learn a general programming language. 2, learn some Linux fundamentals. And so just knowing here are the types of topics that DevOps includes is very useful to then go further search on things that interest you. Because it's such a vast landscape that even knowing what to Google, I think is the key place to get started.
Yeah. I was going to make a comment there. Everyone uses the word Google. I don't use Google, so I've been trying not to use that term as a verb anymore.
Should we Bing it or Brave or DuckDuckGo it?
Yeah,
what do we use instead? Okay, DuckDuckGo it.
All right. So, and I'm sure you have videos on all these topics on your channel.
Many of them, yes. And I'm hoping this quarter to start adding sort of a larger project format where I'll have a continuous series where I'm building out a DevOps system, we'll call it, and choosing one of the tools in each of these categories and implementing it for that project. So I think that'll be a valuable series as people want to follow along. Yeah, I'm really excited about it. Follow along in that journey. And so I'll have a video in which I'll highlight, oh, here are the different infrastructure as code tools. Here are the pros and cons of them. I'm choosing this one, and then a follow-on video where I actually implement that one for my application.
That's cool. Yeah, you'll have to let me know when you're doing that and I can post it.
Cool. Sounds good. Maybe I'll. I also need to build an actual application, so I might need some help on that front.
You can use one of my applications. That's the big bottleneck that I have. It's like, oh, I built this application, but I don't want to deploy it. All right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thanks so much for your time today. If anyone has any questions about DevOps, definitely check out DevOps Directive channel. The link is in the description, and he has a ton of great videos and content. And if you have any more questions, you can post them in my Discord or reach out to Sid, and he's much more of an expert on the topic. So yeah, have a great day, everyone, and I'll be back with another career focused live stream next week.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Gwen.